The news van hummed with a low vibration as it cut through the arid, flat expanse of the highway. The asphalt ribbon stretched ahead, a dark line through a sea of sand and scrub brush that shimmered in the oppressive heat. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the desolate beauty outside. It was a mobile command center, cramped with equipment and thick with the unspoken tension of a team about to step into the unknown. Maya, the producer, was in the back, her face illuminated by the glow of a laptop screen as she cross-referenced coordinates and satellite images for the 100th time. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a deep line etched between her eyes that spoke of years spent calculating risks. In the passenger seat, Kenji, the cameraman, meticulously checked his primary camera, his movements precise and almost meditative. He was a man of few words, his communication done through the lens of his camera, capturing the raw, unfiltered truth of the situations they were sent into. And driving was Liam. He was their anchor, their protector, the one who navigated them through both the physical and human landscapes of the world's most dangerous places. His presence was one of quiet, coiled strength. He wasn't just their driver, he was their security. He was a man who seemed to see everything without appearing to look, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors, the roadside, the distant horizon. He was a former Navy SEAL, a fact that was known but never discussed. To Maya and Kenji, he was simply Liam, reliable, unflappable, and the safest person they knew to have in a firefight. This assignment was a standard one for them, a human interest story from a forward operating base in Ajaccio. They were to document the work of a frontline surgical team, the medics and doctors who pieced together soldiers and civilians alike, often with limited supplies and under constant threat. It was a story about hope and humanity in the heart of conflict, a narrative they had told many times before. Liam pulled the van up to the first of many military checkpoints. The air outside, filtered through the van's AC, felt heavy and tasted of dust. A young soldier, his face a mask of serious professionalism beneath his helmet, approached the driver's side. Liam rolled down the window, a preemptive calmness in his movements. He handed over their credentials and the embedded media paperwork. The soldier studied them, his gaze flicking from the laminated cards to the faces in the van, his expression betraying nothing. After a long, scrutinizing moment, he handed them back and gave a curt nod. "Follow the main road to the FOB, don't deviate. The local nationals have been advised, but stay vigilant." The warning was rote, but it hung in the air. Liam simply nodded, rolled up the window, and the van lurched forward, and passing through the maze of concrete barriers and razor wire. The FOB was a small, self-contained world of dust, camouflage, and controlled chaos. They were met by a public affairs officer, a cheerful captain named Miller, who seemed to thrive on the energy of the base. He led them through the camp, pointing out the mess hall, the sleeping quarters, and finally to the heart of their story, the medical tent. The tent was a world away from the sterile, brightly lit operating rooms back home, and it was functional and grim. Portable surgical lights hung from the metal framework, casting a stark, white glare. The air was thick with the smells of antiseptic, blood, and the ever-present dust. The canvas walls did little to mute the sounds of the base, the distant thump of helicopters, the rumble of generators. Captain Miller introduced them to the lead surgeon, a tired-eyed commander whose fatigues were wrinkled and stained. He was polite but distracted, and his mind clearly on the tasks at hand. "We're expecting a busy afternoon," he said, his voice flat. "A patrol was hit by an IED a few clicks out. They're bringing them in now. You can observe from that corner. Stay out of the way." The words had barely left his mouth when the air outside erupted with the frantic whump, whump, whump of a medevac helicopter. The sound was urgent, a mechanical heartbeat of distress. Maya grabbed Kenji's arm, and they moved to the designated corner. Liam, as always, He positioned himself slightly behind them, a silent guardian with his back to the canvas wall, his eyes taking in the entire tableau. The rotor's noise grew to a deafening crescendo, and then the helicopter was on the ground. A whirlwind of dust and noise swept through the tent as the stretcher teams rushed out. They were back in seconds, moving with a terrifying, practiced speed. The first stretcher held a soldier, his face pale and streaked with blood and dirt, his leg a mangled mess of torn fabric and crimson. The surgical team descended upon him, a flurry of gloved hands and clipped, urgent commands. Kenji's camera was already rolling, capturing the frantic, life-saving dance, but Liam's gaze was fixed on the second stretcher. It was being carried by two soldiers, their faces etched with a different kind of shock, a raw, personal horror. On it lay another casualty, but this one was different. This was a woman. Her hair was matted with blood and sand. And her face, though smudged with dirt and grime, was fine-boned and striking, but it was the tattoos on her arms that snagged Liam's attention. They were faded, almost obscured by dirt and blood, but the patterns were unmistakable. They were not the typical anchor or semper fi ink of a marine. These were intricate, geometric, and they told a story he knew well. They marked her as one of them, as a fellow operator. The medical team shifted, momentarily confused. "Who is this?" a nurse demanded, from her voice sharp. "She's not on the patrol manifest." "She's a local," one of the stretcher-bearers gasped, his voice thick with emotion. "She was a farmer or something. When the truck hit the IED, she was in a field nearby. She ran straight into the kill zone. Pulled Petty Officer Davis out of the wreckage before the secondary. Took shrapnel in the back and neck doing it. She saved his life." The information landed in the tent like another explosion. A local woman. A farmer. How she had run into an ambush to save an American sailor. The dissonance was staggering. Liam watched as they transferred her to a gurney, his mind refusing to reconcile the image of the woman on the stretcher with the story of the farmer. The tattoos screamed a different truth. They were old, the ink faded, but the patterns were specific. They were from a unit he had once worked alongside years ago in a different part of this fractured country. A unit of Kurdish female fighters, in the Women's Protection Units, the YPJ. He had seen their courage, their ferocity, their skill firsthand. They were not farmers. They were lions. The surgeon, the one who had seemed so tired and detached, was now a different man. He was focused, his hands moving with swift, sure precision as he assessed the woman's wounds. She had taken shrapnel to her upper back and the side of her neck. It was bad. They cut away her clothing, revealing more of the tattoos that Liam had glimpsed. Nay, they were a map of her life, a testament to battles fought and survived. Her body, lean and corded with muscle, bore the roadmap of a warrior. Old scars from bullet grazes, a long, puckered line from a knife wound on her ribs. This was no farmer. The medical team worked in a focused bubble, oblivious to the story written on her skin. They were fighting for her life, and that was all that mattered. They intubated her, the tube a stark intrusion against her pale lips. And they worked to stabilize her, their voices a low, urgent hum. Kenji captured it all, the stark poetry of the struggle between life and death. Hours bled into one another. The light outside the tent shifted from the harsh white of midday to the softer, golden glow of late afternoon. The first soldier, the one from the patrol, was stabilized and prepped for evacuation to a larger hospital. The woman, however, remained in a delicate balance. Her vitals were a constant and nerve-wracking dance on the monitors. Liam hadn't moved. He stood in his corner, a silent sentinel, his eyes rarely leaving the woman's face. Maya, noticing his unusual fixation, moved closer to him. "You okay, Liam?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer for a long moment. His jaw was tight, a muscle twitching beneath the stubble. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low it was almost a rumble in his chest. She's not a farmer." Maya looked at him, confused. What do you mean?" The soldiers said. "I know what they said. They're wrong." He gestured with his chin toward the woman's arms, now partially exposed as a nurse adjusted a line. "See the tattoos? The patterns? That's not decoration. That's a history. She fought with the YPJ, the Kurdish units. I saw them in the north years ago. They were the best fighters I've ever seen. Fearless." Maya stared at the woman with new eyes. The story had just shifted on its axis, and this wasn't just a tale of civilian bravery. This was something else entirely, something deeper and more complex. She was a warrior, stripped of her context, now lying silent and broken on a cot in an American base, having given everything to save a soldier from an army that, geopolitically, might not even have been her ally. The surgeon finally stepped back, pulling off his gloves with a weary sigh. He looked at the monitors, then at his team. "She's holding," he announced. There's a note of surprise in his voice. "For now. She needs surgery we can't do here. We need to get her to the CSH. The Combat Support Hospital, the next level of care." As they prepared her for the helicopter ride, one of the nurses, a young woman with kind eyes, gently cleaned the dirt from the woman's face. The grime washed away, revealing features that were strong and calm in their unconscious state. It was then that the woman's eyes flickered. They didn't open fully, just a crack, like a sliver of consciousness fighting against the fog of sedation and pain. Her gaze, unfocused and glassy, drifted across the tent. It passed over the surgeon, over the nurse, over Kenji and his camera. Then it landed on Liam. Something in that gaze sharpened, just for an instant. It was a look of assessment, a flicker of the trained warrior beneath the surface of the wounded woman. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, a bridge was built. It was a look that said, "I know you. I know what you are." It was a recognition that transcended language and circumstance. It was operator to operator. Then, her eyes fluttered closed, and she was gone again, sinking back into the abyss of unconsciousness. The silence that fell after that moment was profound. The only sounds were the beeping of the monitors and the distant thrum of the bass. But for Liam, the room was utterly silent. The noise of the tent, the commands of the medics, the quiet sobs of a soldier nearby. It all faded into a dull, meaningless hum. All he could hear was the echo of that silent communication. He was speechless. Not in the physical sense, but in a deeper, more profound way. The stories he could tell, the questions he wanted to ask, the shared history he felt a connection to, they all jammed in his throat, a logjam of emotion and memory. He was a man of action, of communication through gestures and tactical maneuvers, and of bonds forged in fire that needed no words. And in that moment, words felt wholly inadequate. He thought of his own years as a SEAL, the brotherhood, the loss, the moments of impossible courage he had witnessed. He saw all of it reflected in the pale, still face of this woman. He imagined her story, a story he knew the broad strokes of without a single detail. Growing up in a culture that often subjugated women, picking up a weapon to defend her people, fighting against an enemy as brutal as ISIS, facing unspeakable horrors, and surviving. Surviving only to end up here, on a cot in a foreign base, having just performed the most selfless act of all, saving an enemy combatant, or at least a soldier of a nation with complicated ties to her own struggle. The nurses and medics began to wheel her gurney toward the door, toward the waiting helicopter that would take her to the next stage of her fight for survival. As they passed, Liam stepped forward, a subtle movement that brought him to the foot of the stretcher. He didn't touch her, didn't speak. He simply placed his right hand over his heart, his palm flat against his chest. It was a gesture he had seen among the Kurds, a sign of profound respect, of honor, of solidarity from one fighter to another. It was a salute from his soul to hers. No one else in the tent seemed to notice. They were too focused on the logistics of the transfer. But Maya saw, and Kenji, I ever watchful through his lens, captured the moment. The powerful, silent man paying homage to a fallen warrior who had somehow, impossibly, risen. The helicopter lifted off, its rotors beating a frantic rhythm against the darkening sky. Liam stood in the doorway of the tent, watching it become a speck and then disappear. The silence that had filled the room when their eyes met now seemed to follow him, a heavy cloak he couldn't shrug off. He was a man who had seen everything, undone things that would haunt lesser souls. But this woman, this silent, injured, tattooed stranger, had rendered him speechless. She had cracked something open inside him, a place he kept carefully sealed. That night, as the bass settled into its nocturnal rhythm, Liam sat outside the media tent, alone. The stars were brilliant pinpricks in the vast, dark sky. He thought of her, wondering if she would survive the flight, if she would survive the surgery, if she would survive at all. And he thought of the world she would wake up to if she did. A world where she was an anonymous, local national, a farmer's daughter who had done a brave thing. No one would know she was a commander, a veteran of countless battles, a legend among her own people. Her story, her true story, would remain untold, buried under the rubble of war and geopolitical indifference. He felt a profound sense of loss, not for a person he knew, but for a story that would likely never be told. And for a hero who would never be recognized as one. He who had been profiled and praised and thanked for his service sat in the dark, rendered speechless by the sheer, unadulterated, anonymous heroism of a woman who asked for nothing and gave everything. The next day, they continued their assignment. They filmed the surgeons, interviewed the staff, and documented the daily grind of the medical unit. But the story was always there, in the background, a silent presence in Liam's mind. And he made a few discreet inquiries, pulling on old contacts, calling in favors that were years old. The answers were fragmented, pieces of a puzzle. Her name was Aren. She had indeed been a commander in the YPJ. Her unit had been decimated in a fierce battle 2 years prior. She had been reported as killed in action. Somehow, she had survived and disappeared, likely trying to build a new life away from the fighting, only to be caught in another war's crossfire. Weeks later, and back in the newsroom of a bustling city thousands of miles away, the three of them were editing the footage from the assignment. The main story, the one about the surgical team, was coming together well. It was poignant and powerful. Kenji was reviewing raw footage, his face illuminated by the screen. "Hey, Maya, come look at this," he called softly. Maya and Liam gathered around the monitor. Kenji played a clip. It was from the moment just after Aren had been stabilized, right before she was loaded onto the helicopter. The camera had been on a wide shot of the tent, but the focus was soft, capturing the quiet aftermath of the chaos. In the background, almost out of focus, was Liam. They watched as he stepped forward and placed his hand over his heart, a silent, solitary figure paying tribute. The room in the newsroom fell silent. Maya looked at Liam, her eyes glistening. Liam stared at the screen, his face an unreadable mask. The footage was a testament to a moment of profound human connection, a story within a story. They decided, then and there, that this silent tribute, this unknown warrior, had to be the heart of their piece. They wove the footage of her rescue, the frantic efforts to save her life, and that final, silent, powerful gesture from Liam into their report. They told the story of the farmer who saved a soldier. They couldn't tell the full story. They didn't have the proof. And Liam's sources were too sensitive to reveal. But they told the truth of that day, the incredible courage of an unknown woman. The report aired to a wide audience. It was shared, commented on, and praised. People were moved by the story of the brave woman. But for Liam, it was never enough. He knew the whole truth. He knew the depth of her sacrifice, the layers of her courage. He remained speechless, not because he had nothing to say, but because the true story was too big, too complex, and too sacred to be contained by the simple words of a television news report. It was a story written in blood, in faded tattoos, and in a single, silent look of recognition between two warriors in a dusty tent. A story that would forever echo in the quiet corners of his own soul.